Welcome to the Power Panel Podcast Echoes, a segment of our show dedicated to intergenerational conversations with some of Africa's young, dynamic women leaders. I am your host, Ambassador Rachael Akidi, a senior counsel, diplomat, and former cabinet minister in Kenya. I am so thrilled to introduce our guest today. She is Rachael Akidi Okwir, one of Africa's most renowned media professionals. She's currently the CEO of Reebo Consult, but prior to this, Rachael worked for the BBC World Service, holding key leadership positions as senior news editor, head of East Africa languages, as well as the head of journalism for Africa. She is a celebrated strategist and changemaker and inspires thousands of people in her home country of Uganda and throughout our continent. Welcome to the Power Panel Podcast Echoes, Rachael. I want to start this interview by confessing to something. Do you know that I've always wanted to be you? Really, honestly. You have the career I dreamt of when I was 17 years old. It's shocking. God. And it's so uncanny that you're also called Rachael, that you're East African, and I have you on the Power Panel podcast. I mean, it's nuts. It's crazy.
I know it is. And, when you reached out, I was humbled because I've always followed you. And so when your colleague came and talked to me at the conference, I was really humbled. When he said you had been sitting in the audience and you had said he should, reach out and get my number. I was really humbled. So it's quite humbling to hear that, this is the sort of career you've always wanted, being in the media. It's no surprise that you're doing a podcast.
Your career, from reading about it, from hearing you speak, has been an illustrious career. And I want to ask you, where did this attraction to journalism come from? Why did you want to be a storyteller?
It's been, quite interesting. Because I was, as you say, I was born in Uganda. And I was born to a civil servant and a banker. And I was raised in a family of only girls. It was a girl-only family. And I remember my dad was always taunted for having only girls. Mm-hmm. But looking back, I think he was actually some sort of feminist. He was an advocate for girl-child education, and he really ensured that we all got a decent education. He was a firstborn child in a polygamous family. And I remember having lots of relatives coming to stay with us at different intervals of my childhood. And these were relatives from both sides, both my mother's side, my father's side, because he was what I would describe as the de facto educationist in the family. He was the first university graduate, and he really wanted to ensure that all his siblings got some level of education. And, growing up in a polygamous family, I think it was difficult for many of them. So he tried to ensure he educated them. And he also always reminded us that education was the best or greatest leveler. And that if we were educated, our backgrounds really didn't matter. We could do anything and work anywhere in the world. So education wasn't something that had to be, or that was debated in our household. It was not optional. It was a path that everybody was expected to take. Almost the rite of passage we all, had to undergo.
Paint a picture for me of your early education years. Did you enjoy school?
Now, even if my parents came from different parts of the country, we lived in a small town called Entebbe, and that's really been home since. And I went to a primary school called Lake Victoria. It was set up for I think the colonial governors and later African civil servants in the 60s. And then went to an all-girls secondary school in the east of the country. And I think it's in this boarding school that I began to chart out what I wanted to be, including being a journalist. I think the school shaped the person that I was, later to become. It was an all-round education, academics. They were very strict when it came to academics. We had extracurricular activities. In fact, I think one of the things that I really liked about Rural Girls was we studied up to lunchtime. In the afternoon, we were free to do other activities. So we had home economics, we had a cooking lab. We learned how to cook and bake. And then we had a typing pool because this was in the 90s. We didn't have computers then. And we learned how to type using typewriters. So compared to most schools at the time, I think it was a great school.
Were you curious about current affairs and world events in your early years?
I used to watch a lot of TV. I loved reading. I loved literature. And I remember watching, and I always loved newspapers. Like when my dad would come home with newspapers, we would fight for the papers. So he would come home with different newspapers, and my sisters and I would usually grab until he got to a point where he said, now you need to share, pull out some pages and give this one. And I would read them back to back, which was really weird. And then there was a guy called Toya Kilama who used to be a journalist, and he used to travel with the president. And he was part of the presidential press unit. And by then we only had one channel, which was the state broadcaster, UBC. So whether you liked it or not, that was all you're going to watch when it came to TV. So he used to travel with the president, and you'd see him reporting from different parts of the world. We're in Libya, we're in Nairobi, in Brazil, in Washington. And I really looked at him and wanted to be him. I wanted that job, to be a journalist, to be able to travel. So that was really my first inspiration. I kept thinking, when I go to university, everybody wanted to be a lawyer, they wanted to be doctors, but I was very clear from the beginning that I wanted to be a journalist. And the reason really was driven by, the sense I got that they travel, they go to these interesting places, but most of all, they meet very interesting people and cover very interesting stories. And so that was really my inspiration at a very young age.
So it was a combination of this very rich education, the attraction to the glamour of journalism, and your love for literature and reading.
Yes.
So how did it all coalesce into going to university to read journalism and later on joining the BBC?
Yeah. So, one of the interesting things that happened was my journey into university wasn't that easy because when I was doing my A-levels, I remember my mom coming to school on visitation day because I was in a boarding school, and she was visibly sad. So she told us, our dad had been retrenched, and, he had been a civil servant, a senior civil servant all his life. And there was a change of government. So the new government was implementing some structural adjustment policies that were apparently initiated by some multilateral financial institutions. So part of the plan included laying off thousands of civil servants. And this was tough because I remember we had to move house, we had to downsize. And despite this, my family was still determined that our education did not suffer. So our school fees were prioritized, even though sometimes this would be paid late. And I really watched my dad, go through some really low moments of depression. And I think knowing what I know now as an adult, it must have been very tough for him. And I watched, my mom step in, to become the main breadwinner. And she was such a fighter. My mom wasn't educated to university, but my goodness, I don't think I've met anyone who values university education as much as she does. So she took over the reins. And unfortunately, about 3 years later, even before my dad could get a job, the bank she was working with also conducted a restructuring and she was laid off.
Oh, no.
And so instead of sitting and crying, she started a number of businesses to try and sustain the family and really ensure that we got to university. So my elder sister, Susan, completed her A-levels before me, obviously. And then she sacrificed her university education because she started working to pay our fees. And I remember growing up and saying, I want the same for my younger siblings, but also I want to ensure that Susan at some point returns back to school and completes her university education. And she did, at some point, and she even now has an MBA, which is great.
Oh, wow.
So I worked hard and I made sure that I had to get to university. And one of my dad's uncles, my dad's brothers, who was my uncle, offered to pay for my undergraduate education at Makerere. And he was somebody who my dad had educated. And this is why I say my dad, I think his investment paid off. So I went to uni and I studied mass communication. And what I learned is, you just have to, continue to stay afloat, even when life throws, some crazy curveballs at you.
What university did you go to?
To Makerere University in Entebbe. And I was studying journalism. And as unoriginal as it might sound, my dream was actually to work with the BBC.
Okay.
And while I was a student at the university, I was also working part-time. It was with a catering company that provided catering for airlines at Entebbe Airport. And we were called stewards. But the job was really cleaning. So I was a cleaner, making sure that all those trolleys that you got from the aircrafts and crockery were spotless and hygienically cleaned and packed, for the next flight. So that was what I was doing. And I think that was where my leadership journey actually started. That's a story for another time. But yeah, so I was in university. And one day, I remember Shaka Sali, who unfortunately died recently. He used to be a top and prominent VOA journalist. And Shaka was born in Uganda. So one day we were at university and we were told Shaka Sali was going to be coming to speak to us. And we crammed into some small lecture room to listen to him and to see, what he had to say. And I remember it was a really hot afternoon. And, he came in and, shared his journey, from the hills of, Kabale region in Western Uganda to Washington, how he was a child soldier and yet he later acquired a PhD, and how he made it to Voice of America and became, a well-known international journalist. And honestly, for me, it was that day in that hot, crowded lecture room that I believe I began to believe that my international journalism dream was possible. Because if Shaka, a former child soldier from rural Uganda could make it, why not me? Mm-hmm. So I began to aspire and actually believe this was possible. And I remember one day, I was working with some British Airways crew and they asked me, so you're a student as well? Because I used to meet the crew with my part-time job. And I said, yeah, I'm a student. And they said, so what do you do? What are you studying? I said, I'm studying journalism. And they're like, oh, so you want to be a journalist? I said, yeah. So where do you want to work? And I said, I want to work with the BBC. And I could tell, they smiled and looked at each other. And none of them, was courageous enough to tell me, that is almost an impossible dream. Because the look they had was like,
not happening.
Here in Entebbe loading aircrafts. How the hell are you going to get to the BBC? And then one of them said, well, that's a great ambition you have there. But you do know it's very difficult to get into the BBC. And I said, yeah, but you asked me about my ambition and my dream job after graduation, and that is my dream job.
How did your dream of working with the BBC actually materialize?
So it was quite interesting. There were so many things that just aligned. And then one day, I'd barely graduated when my dad came home and he was carrying a newspaper. I remember it was the East African newspaper. And he just tossed it at me and said, the BBC has advertised and they're looking for journalists. And I remember laughing out loud because I'd literally graduated a few months before. I barely had any serious journalism experience. And the experience I had was through volunteering. I'd been volunteering over the weekend at an all-women radio station in Kampala. And I was working as a news producer and presenter. And then I was also contributing as a freelance writer to some of the local daily newspapers. So that was as much, about the experience that I had. So when he said the BBC's recruiting, the first thing that came to mind was how, of all the experienced journalists in Africa, could they choose me? So I remember him looking at me and saying, come on, you can do this. How can you not believe in yourself? I think you can. So when I looked at the advert, I realized that actually he was right. I could convince the recruiter that the part-time journalism work I'd been doing while studying could actually add up to the 2 years experience that they were looking for. But I also made it clear that I told them that and acknowledged that, yes, I was young, I was inexperienced, but I really wanted to grow within this organization. So I kept remembering Shaka made it, so surely they might be able to pick me since, they've come out to Africa to recruit. So I wrote a very convincing letter. And a couple of weeks later, I was invited to Nairobi for an interview. And I think I always like to say the two people on the panel, Robin White, Ben Marlow, who were the editors at the time, really just took a gamble on me. I was only 22 years old, but they recognized my potential.
What do you think they saw?
They gave me a chance.
What did they see? Did they see passion? What did they see, do you think?
I think it was the potential, because I remember one time Ben Marlow, so when I moved to work with him, he told me, when you came, we were quite surprised, first of all, at how young you were, but also how intelligent and clued up you were. And you were the least experienced among the people we recruited. But there was just a sudden spark, that's the way he put it, that there was a sudden spark in your eyes and an eagerness to learn. And we just thought, you know what, this is someone we could try and, groom and should grow within the organization. So they gave me a chance. And I always say this to my managers and people that I've led, that if you meet young and raw talent, try and support them, because you just never know where they're going to get. Because I feel, they took me on, threw me in the deep end, but they also supported me. And I was able to learn how to swim. And this is where I am.
Did you start your career in Nairobi, or did you start it in the United Kingdom?
I started it in the UK. So when I did this interview, I flew off to London to join the BBC World Service.
That must have been very exciting.
It was exciting. It was life-changing. It was challenging.
In what way?
Because,
in what way?
Yeah, so I was going away from my family, moving into a new country, new culture, new organization. It was my first real job, if you like. And suddenly I'm in this very multicultural environment, meeting people from countries I've never been to, some countries I've never heard of. And it was fun to be there and to just be sitting, and everybody felt like really intelligent, like everybody was so sharp. And so it was intimidating initially, getting there.
Do you suffer from imposter syndrome?
I did a lot. And I think one of the challenges I had was within, I think it was about 4 months of being there, I was given a leadership position to basically lead some of the output. So we used to have a program called Network Africa, which used to go out early in the morning. It was a flagship breakfast program for Africa. So I was appointed to act as a night editor, because it was a night program, because it was a breakfast program in Africa. So I had to lead the team. And I think one of the biggest challenges is getting into leadership at a very young age. Leading people much older than me, more experienced than me. I think some of them even started journalism before I even started school. And yet I had to make editorial decisions and lead that entire team and the output. And that was quite challenging, because, what do you do? When you've got a title, but you haven't got the experience,
Mm-hmm.
you've got the knowledge and potential, but you got this baby face, that betrays you. And, your boss respects you, they support you, but then you suspect that, some of your colleagues simply don't understand why you're in the role because they're looking at you and thinking, gosh, she just came and she's so young. And yet she's being told to make decisions on our behalf, to actually judge our work because I had to sign off their work.
Oh my goodness.
So that was a conflict area and it was quite challenging. And I did suffer from, imposter syndrome. It was tough because the truth is people doubted my competency. And then I had the imposter syndrome, the self-doubt. Sometimes I doubted my decisions when I was challenged. And so it can be quite, intimidating. Sometimes some of them resisted, actually, my leadership, my young leadership. And it was, quite interesting.
What do you mean resisted? I mean, when you say people resisted your leadership, I'm wondering what you mean by that and how did you tackle that resistance?
Yes. So the main thing was really around taking instructions and directions from a younger team member and sometimes challenging everything, every editorial decision that I made. I had to consistently defend the decisions I was making because as an editor, you have to sign off anything that's going out in the output. And so suddenly here I was signing off work that has been done by people who are more experienced than me. And so if I changed anything, they're like, okay, why are you changing this? Or why do we have to lead with that story? Why don't we lead with this other story? But I think one of the things that I did was ensure that I communicated very clearly with them. I gave them clear reasons. And the one thing I was confident in was my editorial judgment. So I would tell them why, I'm making the editorial decisions the way I was making them. The other thing was also respecting them, um, you rejecting their ideas with respect, because, in Africa, you have to respect your elders. And I understood that they were more experienced. I understood where they were coming from. And this thing also comes down to empathy, trying to see them, myself in them. Because if I was them, I'd probably be thinking the same.
Mm-hmm.
And so I tried to understand where they were coming from and why they tried to be challenging. And you know what is interesting is I remember about 10 years later when I was now a fully blown leader, one of them actually sent me a message and told me, when you first started, I really didn't understand why you were given this job because I thought you were very young and inexperienced, and suddenly you're being made to lead the rest of us who were very experienced. And I'm sorry for giving you a hard time.
Oh,
So
wow.
I think one of the other things that also saved me was I was naive. So there were times when I didn't even notice
Okay.
that some of this was deliberate. I thought it just, that's
Yeah.
what happens in a newsroom. It was until this person actually confessed that I was like, oh, so was that deliberate? I thought you guys were just being really weird and funny.
Was the fact that you're a young African woman a contributing factor to that resistance?
There could have been many reasons. I think there was an issue around age. There was an issue around being an African. There was an issue around being a woman. It could have been any of
Any
those
of them.
things.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And I think one thing I really tried to do was to just learn how to navigate, authority and respect and just balance, the way I handled all these people. And I think it was one of the most challenging tasks and significant challenges of my leadership journey, getting into leadership at a very young age.
Well,
Yeah.
I think you've succeeded because, look, you've done everything. You've been a producer, you've been an editor, you've been a reporter, you're the head of East African languages, head of journalism for Africa, you've been in charge of Focus for Africa. You've done everything. And I want you to help me understand how you got to know yourself through that leadership. Because I think knowing your own abilities, knowing who you are, is quite central to being a good leader. And to help us think this through, I want you to listen to an audio clip from another woman leader that I've interviewed, Her Excellency Zainab Bangura. And this is what she says.
When I choose my staff, I don't choose staff that have the same quality like my skills. I know the first thing for me I learned, knowing my ability, what I can do, what I cannot do. So when I recruit people to work with me, I chose people who do things that I cannot do. So it's teamwork.
So basically, Zainab is saying that to lead well, you need to have self-awareness. Mm-hmm. And in all these challenges you had as a young leader, what is your most powerful attribute that you began to notice and you could see that if you wielded with invention and with skill, you could get what you wanted from people?
I think one of the most powerful attributes I have is empathy. And I think my first venture into leadership at the BBC was terrifying, as I said, but it made me realize that I had to be sympathetic and empathetic with especially younger staff and introverts like me, because I was both I believe people didn't understand me in the beginning. Some people felt journalists have to be loud and talkative. As a leader, you should be standing on tables and telling people off, which I was not. And I just couldn't, because that's just not me. So when I became a leader, I was very intentional about recognizing and supporting people like me. So I lead with empathy. I know there are some people who say, empathetic leaders are weak, but I actually believe empathy is strength. And there's just something so powerful in listening to people and trying to understand their points of view, whether in the end you agree with them or you don't. Understanding where they're coming from is so important, and it's actually really empowering. And I found that doing that helped me build trust with the people that I was leading. And, I like to be myself. When I was younger, I struggled with this. I worked so hard to, improve my weaknesses. And then I actually realized along the way that why am I struggling with, my weaknesses? Why can't I just build on my strengths? That was another thing. So I decided I want to be authentic. I just want to be me. And I began working on this, becoming more authentic. And this is what really helped me also deal with, the issues like imposter syndrome. So for me, it was the empathy, it was the authenticity. And then I'm quite open when it comes to communication. I'm very open and direct. I am like an open book. I think for most people, they know that what you see is what you get, with Rachael. And that value really helped me build trust with the people that I lead as well. Because I always tell, my younger leadership mentees that it's important that people feel they can trust you as a leader, because it's almost impossible to lead if the people you're leading, do not trust you. So for me, that is really quite a significant value that I hold. But most importantly, I think it was the empathy. It started from there. Then the authenticity, being able to be open, giving people feedback. When it's great programs we've made, that was amazing. And when it's not, I would say it's not. And one of the things, and I used to do that even before I began to lead. And I remember sitting in some of the editorial meetings where people would go around, because every time we had a program, we would review it as a team. What worked, what didn't work. And so there's some people who will just say, oh my God, it was amazing. It was all really good. And so they'll go around the room and then they finally come to me and I say, well, I thought this worked well, but I actually thought this interview was crap. And this is why. And then suddenly they all sit back and think, actually, you're right. Yeah, you could have asked this question and you could have asked that question. And so I realized every time we had the feedback, people valued my opinion because they knew I was going to give them an honest opinion. I was not just going to massage the ego of the presenter and the producers. I would tell them what I truly felt, but with specifics about where I felt they could have improved or could have done better. So people began to trust me. And I think that is how I was able to finally build and grow into leadership and also build the trust, the respect from the team that I began to lead as I began to climb up the ladder.
But being authentic also requires courage.
Yes.
Yes, it requires courage. So do you consider yourself a courageous person? I mean, to be able to take a completely different view from 10 people sitting in a room.
Yes. I think one of the things that I've always liked about me is daring to be different. I don't mind being different. In fact, I prefer to be different. So I believe that's where my courage to be different comes from. But the real thing for me is I'm just so honest. And I feel if I don't say what I feel, I will live with it. And I'll constantly be regretting, I'll become resentful. So I'd rather, not praise something that I genuinely don't believe is good. I'd rather keep quiet then. And that is how I was. I was like, guys, if I have to give you feedback, it has to be genuine.
Okay.
I'm not going to pretend that this was great when it wasn't. And so here are my thoughts. So I think being authentic is hard, I think, for most people. But once you get there, it's about really understanding who you are, being confident in who you are. And I know who Rachel is. I know Rachel's flaws. I know her weaknesses. And I just love being Rachel.
Okay. So it's self-love, actually. That courage comes from self-love. Okay. As we take this short power break, we ask that you subscribe to the Power Panel podcast. Let's work together to expand the Power Panel community. Visit our website, birdsongafrica.com, and follow us on social media to plug into the Power Panel network. Email your thoughts to hello@birdsongafrica.com. This is the Power Panel podcast. Echoes. So I just wanted to just explore your work a little bit further and to look at it in terms of power and responsibility. For many Africans, especially Africans of my age group, I mean, the BBC was the only credible news outlet, If you hadn't heard it on the BBC, then it didn't happen or it wasn't true. And you have led some important programs for the BBC, whether it's focused on Africa, whether being, the head of journalism for Africa. So in other words, you have this power as an editor to shape people's narratives, to shape the narrative around Africa, to shape people's feelings about Africa, to influence decision and policy. Did you have a sense of the might of that power and that responsibility? Because it's massive. It's massive.
What is interesting is when I got that job, I didn't know it was going to be as big as it was. So I, fly off from London, come to Nairobi, to lead this expansion. And, when I was leaving, I remember I told my team, I said, I don't know whether I would have applied for this job if I'd known it was going to be as big and as influential as it was. And I don't think I ever sat down and thought, gosh, this is really, really powerful. Most times it was people who reminded me that this was a very huge position and, responsibility that I was carrying. And I found it's mainly through the way people respond to you. That was one. Because what I did was really focus on what I needed to deliver, on the strategy. This is what I needed to do. We need to recruit. We need to move the bureau. We need to expand. We need to train. We need to launch programs. So that was where really my focus was. Plus, of course, the troubleshooting, and there was a lot of that during the expansion in Kenya and the region. So that was where my focus really started. So I'm not sure I sat down to actually reflect on that. It was after I was leaving that I thought, wow, that was actually really powerful. And when I began to rise with colleagues, I started rising up, from as a rank and file journalist. I kept climbing the ladder. And then I think one of the other issues was transitioning from peer to become a leader. And that was also one of the most complicated journeys.
What was complicated about it?
Because 1 minute I'm your buddy, and then next I'm your boss. And then there's sometimes when I became my boss's boss, my former boss's boss.
I just want to, you've raised something very interesting that I hadn't even thought about as I was coming to sitting down and thinking about what to ask you over this interview. Is that transition, when you rise up the ladder, how you manage alterations in relationships and how you maintain those relationships, but keep moving forward without trampling on people's heads, humiliating people, without being big-headed yourself.
Yes.
What is that trick?
It was a tough one as well. That I think was one of, because the initial one was becoming a leader at a very young age. So the second one was transitioning from peer to the real leader in charge of the whole team. And these guys have been your friends. You've been working together. You go out to the pub to have drinks together. You invite them to your house. And then suddenly this relationship has changed because you're now, their manager. And so it involved a lot of relationship engineering, You have to recognize that the relationships have to change, especially the personal relationships, because personal and supervisory are really not compatible. And then you also realize that, the expectations from your colleagues, begin to change as well. They begin to look at you differently, whether you like it or not. I remember how one of my colleagues, so they used to go, we had a club, like a BBC club in Bush House, where you'd go and have a drink after work. So they would always leave and go down to the club. And so one day he came and he's like, Rachel, sorry, we're leaving you behind. So I was still sitting at my desk and he said, because you're now a boss, you can't come with us because we're going to be gossiping about all the bosses, and including yourself. And so he said it with a lot of humor, and I laughed and I just let it pass. Sometimes they'd invite me to join them and I would go and, join them, have a drink, and then go home afterwards. So I think it becomes difficult, but you have to establish your authority with colleagues who might still view you as a colleague, as a peer, as an equal. There has to be a bit of a distance. And for me, it meant it's not like I stop talking to you or stop cracking jokes. I still do that. Even here in Nairobi, I had people who I think were my friends, because sometimes they'll invite me, say, hey, let's go and have, some Ethiopian food over the weekend. And I'll say, okay, fine, I'll come and join you. And then I join them. And when I get back to the office on Monday, it's like, okay, so how come you haven't done this? And I remember when I was leaving, a few of them mentioned that. They're like, they found it quite fascinating how I was able to remain approachable, but at the same time be very professional and serious when it came to work and hold them to account.
So is it true that it gets lonelier as you climb up the ladder? It's lonely at the top.
It is. And I think this hit me fast in London when I realized I couldn't do the things that I used to do with my team. And I used to look at them as my friends. And then suddenly, I'm their boss. So I can no longer talk to them the way I used to talk to them. I can no longer engage in certain conversations. I can no longer go out with them the way I used to. And so when you're sitting at your desk, you have to make difficult decisions, and you're on your own most of the time. And that's why it's really important, I think, as young leaders to, find other sources of support, mentors, other peers at that level who might be working in different departments or even different organizations, and I think that was partly what helped me. I had some good mentors who were able to support me, because you really don't have anyone to talk to. Because sometimes you want to vent And you cannot vent to your team. You cannot vent to your manager. And so where do what's the outlet? So you need an outlet to be able to, explain yourself and just share and pour out whatever is on your mind. And so for me, it was the mentoring, the coaches, and the other support that I had outside work that really helped.
Now, leadership is also about ethics and integrity. I wonder, in an organization like the BBC, where you're dealing with news, you're dealing with, events that are evolving across the continent and the planet, what were the key moral dilemmas that you were confronting every day in deciding this should be on the news and this shouldn't be on the news, or you should be reporting this and you shouldn't be reporting that? I'm very struck by the power of this job, its responsibility, and its challenges.
Yeah, so I think there were many dilemmas. Every day was different. And, coming down and doing this job from Africa, because even when I was in London, I was leading teams based in Africa. So now coming down to the ground was even more challenging, because when you're on the ground, you understand the context more. You understand the realities more than when you're far away, and you see what you're dealing with. And I think one of the biggest challenges, if you asked me, that I dealt with was during the war in Ethiopia in 2020, 2021. I had a team that was responsible for covering that region in 3 languages, from Ethiopia and Eritrea. And a lot of this team were affected by that civil war. And yet, they had to cover the story daily. I think if you recall, the northern part of the country was cut off. There was a communications blackout. There was no internet, no comms. There was no movement. There were no vehicles traveling to that part of the world. So I had a whole team who didn't know whether their families were dead or alive for nearly a whole year. And yet, they had to cover the story. And I had to insist to them that you have to be impartial in the story. Yes, there's some it's an ethnic conflict. There are all these ethnic tensions that are happening, but you're going to have to be impartial as a BBC journalist. And I remember one time, one of them calling me. I was working from home because it was in the middle of lockdown. And he said, 2 of his brothers had been killed. He said, allegedly, by the security forces. And he had been called and informed, and then he couldn't reach them again. So he was grieving, but he didn't know the context and the detail until a couple of weeks later. So he called to tell me, and I don't know why, he just said, I want to talk to you. I want to thank you for all the support you've given. Because of COVID, we're not able to travel. But I also want to give you a bit of background of who I am. And he said, my mom is a coffee farmer. She raised 7 boys single-handedly as a coffee farmer. She never went to university, but she ensured that all 7 of us got a university education. And now 2 of her sons have been killed. And apparently the people who killed her sons went and razed down her coffee farm and the plantation and the warehouses and everything. And so she had now been taken to Addis to live in an apartment with one of her brothers. And he was very emotional about it. He told me, my mom can't live in an apartment. She's supposed to be in the rural area. That's the life she's known. That was her livelihood. And he said, so you keep telling us that we have to be impartial and to follow BBC guidelines. So how do you think I can cover the government or the security forces impartially? Rachel, you tell me. And I remember sitting on the other side and thinking, yeah, how? How can he possibly do that? Because that was a really difficult question. And what I told him was, I think in situations like this is you have to almost, in law, I think you call it recusing yourself, like pass that story on to someone else. Tell your editor, I cannot do the story. If you're allocated a story that has something to do with the government or the security, let some other journalist do it. You don't have to be the one to do it, because you are clear and are sure that you'll not be impartial when it comes to a story like that. So those were some of the most difficult challenges. So you're managing people's emotions. You're trying to cover this big war in Africa's second largest, most populated country. And at the same time, you're trying to make sure that the journalism is up to BBC standard. So it was difficult. I won't lie. It was difficult. And I think that was one of the most difficult challenges.
What does that do to you as a person when you're dealing with the moral dilemma?
I feel that, it makes you reflect. There were moments when actually it was tough for me as well. Because I could see these people were breaking. I could see they were suffering. And yet my powers are limited. So they're looking at you and saying, okay, can't you tell the government to do this? Can't you? And we tried, And what I did was, just try and empathize with them, see where they're coming from, but still be able to challenge them where I felt we were getting it wrong. I put in place, measures to ensure that, we covered this conflict fairly and impartially, represented all the different views to it, because it was a conflict that, polarized the country. So we had to be able to represent that. And on top of that, you're having pressure from the government. I'm getting someone to the ambassador's office, by foreign office, to explain stories that we were doing. And so I'm literally cornered and trying to keep everything afloat. And I'm going to explain, our decisions. I constantly have to review. And I think one thing I haven't mentioned is some of these languages, I don't speak them. I don't speak these languages.
Okay.
But I was in charge of them.
Yes.
And so sometimes when there's a complaint, I have to get it, translated. And then I review it, see whether it meets BBC standards. And if it does, I have to unfortunately tell them we stand by our journalism. If it doesn't, then we have to apologize and correct the story. So it was quite difficult. So emotionally, yes, you end up getting quite overwhelmed. But what I've learned over the years is to separate my personal emotions with the job. Because there's some difficult things you have to do on the job. And I've always said there's Rachel and there's the BBC. So what I'm doing for the BBC is not Rachel. It's the BBC that I'm doing it. And that's my coping mechanism. When I'm going into meetings that I know are going to be really difficult, I put on what I call my bulletproof vest, emotional bulletproof vest. And I'm like, I'm not going to get emotional about this. This is going to be here. We'll look at it rationally and we'll try and deal with the issue as it is, rather than making it affect me emotionally and personally. So I think trying to keep that distance between who I am and the job has helped me manage some of these moral and really difficult dilemmas.
Well, it couldn't have been easy, especially being summoned by the government and all the rest of it. Can't be easy. Now, I just want to talk about change, managing change. And one of the things that you have been praised for and received a lot of accolades around is the way you managed to move the Nairobi bureau to this place that, employed about 300 people. You moved it from a linear style of journalism to digital platforms. And you were just this creative change maker. Now, when I was listening to you speak at the African Media Festival, you zeroed in on fear and change and how fear is such an important impediment when it comes to change, but it's also an empowering attribute also. Just explain to us how you manage this fear dialectic as you brought about these tremendous transformations at the BBC Africa Bureau.
So fear is quite interesting because it does affect everyone, even the leaders. And I have to say that when it comes to change, we all react the same way. Because I think my first transition to change was leaving the UK and coming here to take up this job. I was excited that I've gotten this big job. But I remember being paralyzed in some way because, there were all issues to do with, moving, the family, deciding what's going to happen, then moving to a new country, a new job. It was until I went to attend some training just before I left that I realized I was actually dealing with the change curve as well. I was still in shock and denial. So when I came over, I was somehow, trying to get my head around, the new landscape and all the the transformation that needed to happen within a year. And then I realized that some of the people that I was actually leading, who were supposed to be leading this change, were not doing what they were supposed to be doing. And it was at that point that I realized I'm expecting them to do this, but this is a huge shift for them as well. And so how can they do it when they are themselves afraid? How can they lead when they themselves are afraid? And so I began to look at it, differently. I began to speak more to people to try and understand, their fears, because change is quite unsettling, for everyone. We as human beings love comfort. We love to remain in our comfort zones. And what I've learned is that people don't resist change. Most times they resist loss. The loss that they're suffering, the workflows, the technology, the colleagues who might leave. That is what they're trying to resist, And then the fear is really about the unknown. Because where are we going? Where are you taking us? Am I going to have the skills in this new future? Am I going to be able to learn the new technology? Will I even still have a job? And so people fear a lot of that. And it's around, losing relevance, losing control, and just knowing, just not knowing what is going to happen. And I always feel, from my experience, you don't overcome it by just ignoring it. You need to confront it. You need to be able to make a commitment that this is what we're going to do. And then bring the team on board by turning it into a shared journey. And this involves being very clear when you come to communications. It's quite shocking how a lot of the time you think, okay, we've communicated the vision. We've sent so many emails. We've had meetings. And then the next time you go into a town hall and they're like, we really don't even understand what's happening. Yes, and you're thinking, hang on, we've said this over and over again. And so one thing I learned was when you speak to people, you just have to really stress certain points and even tell them that is the vision so that they understand directly that is what you're trying to communicate. But also try and get their feedback. I found it really empowering, dealing especially with people who resist, by sitting down with them and trying to understand what they're resisting. And a lot of the time you realize it's this fear, and some of these fears are issues that can be addressed. In fact, most of them. And so what you do is begin to tackle each of those fears and addressing them. If you need training, we're going to put you into training. If you need, we'll set up these courses for you to attend. And a lot of the time, once they begin to get comfortable and they begin to understand where we're supposed to be going, they begin to come on board and embrace it. So it was quite interesting because there was a lot we had to handle at the same time, multiple projects happening all at the same time. And one thing was also trying to make sure they understand that this is the future of the media. So we're not just future-proofing the business, we're also future-proofing you. Because the truth is the media landscape has changed over the last decade. And media houses that are not embracing this change are being left behind. Because the reality is our audiences are not going to wait The technology is not going to wait, and the industry is not going to wait. So if we sit back and relax and think it's just going to go away, we shall become obsolete. And I've told a few teams of mine that we will be obsolete. If you reject the support that you're being given to even develop your skills and upskill, develop digital skills, become a technology journalist. Yes, you joined as a radio journalist, but who knows? You might become, the next AI journalist. So it's always important that, people understand what is in for them as well.
Now, I wonder whether in dealing with change, the attributes that people often identify in women are critical. And I want you to listen to Zainab Bangura again.
The power for women is caring, bringing people together, how you touch their life, how you change their life, what a difference you make to them, how you make them feel. For me, that is power. That's what you do for people to succeed. It is how you give yourself to people for people to understand you are part of them, that you see them, you hear them, you listen to them, you appreciate them.
Now, in dealing with those changes, those transformations that you made at the BBC, did you exemplify these so-called female attributes of leadership?
Yeah, I think I like what Zainab is saying, and I agree with her. I think we are more empathetic as women. We lead with empathy. And to me, that is our power, because we're genuinely interested in caring and supporting people to succeed. And when you're genuinely interested in doing that, they see it. It's easy to get people's buy-in because they trust you. The other thing is you listen. It allows you to be able to listen to their concerns, to be able to listen to some of their challenges. Whether you agree with them or not, you have shown that you have listened. One thing I think with most people is they don't understand when you're a leader, you make strategic decisions based on many other factors. They might be seeing one and may not necessarily understand the big picture. So even getting them to understand that, I think is important. So yes, I agree. The attributes that we have as women, I think really help in bringing that. And I was able to apply, a lot of this as we transitioned. So that's the way I look at it, and that's the way I really lead. I do try and listen because I try and I like solving problems, because I genuinely believe people come in to do a good job. Yes, there will be some people who don't, sometimes in some workplaces, but the majority are there to do something right. And if you empower them, give them the right tools and facilitate them, they will do it and they will deliver. So that listening, that empathy, and that support, I think, is are traits that we have that I think some other people don't have.
So you left the BBC after 21 years.
Yeah.
And you set up a consultancy company. What gap do you want to fill?
So as you know, the media industry as a whole is at a critical inflection point due to digital transformation. Right now, we're seeing AI integration. So I set up a company called Reebo Consult. I mentor, I train, I coach, and I support organizations with digital transformation and more recently with AI deployment. I believe in journalism. I know it's under threat from different corners of the world, but I believe it's important to have the media. So if we transform and fit in with the times that we're in, we can continue to remain relevant to current audiences and to future audiences.
That's a very hopeful note for us to bring our conversation to an end. Before I do so, I want to find out from you what your power mantra is. what do you believe power and leadership are? What's the wise thing you'd say about it to a young journalist?
Power and leadership, what does that mean to me? So I think, to me, it's empathy. It's always doing the right thing. Sometimes the right thing is the hardest thing to do, but you must do the right thing. It's always striving for excellence. And by that, I mean doing your best and being consistent in doing your best. And then challenging yourself to get out of your comfort zone. It doesn't matter which industry you're in, whether you're a journalist, whether you're a banker, monitor the trends in your industry and be on top of them. And then the most important is be authentic and be confident in who you are. And then remain humble, because remember, your reputation, precedes you. And I think this has been even more important for me after I left an institution after many years. And in my consulting world, I've learned that your reputation precedes you. So do your best wherever you're placed.
Thank you so much for that advice and for the very rich discussion we've had. I'm just so happy I've talked to you. And I hope that we can meet in person somewhere,
yes,
in this town or in this world and continue this conversation. We are so grateful to Rachael Akidi Okwir for tracing her pathway to leadership and power in the media sector with us. Her story reveals courage and empathy in the management of people, as well as the readiness to grasp change and to imagine new futures for the media in Africa. There is something so sincere and genuine about Rachael. Consequently, her truths ring loud and clear. We wish her continued success and thank you most sincerely for listening and look forward to your company on our next episode. This is the Power Panel Podcast Echoes.